My beloved friends, let us begin today in the only place where truth may be found, within the silence of your own being. For all the centuries of theology, doctrine, and external searching, humanity has overlooked the simple and profound reality that the entire spiritual life unfolds in consciousness, not in the outer world of changing forms. And so we meet together not to add more beliefs to the mind, not to gather new techniques or mental devices, but to return to that pure awareness which has never left us. There is a misunderstanding that every seeker carries at the beginning of the path. We believe that our suffering is caused by outer events. We believe that discord comes from people, from circumstances, from our past, from the actions of others, or from the movement of this material universe. And from this belief in external causation arises fear, anxiety, worry, and the endless attempt to manage conditions through human effort. But listen carefully, there is no external power acting upon your life. None. What you have assumed to be an outer cause is only the picture formed in consciousness through the lens of separation. The moment you believe that anything outside of your own consciousness has the power to give you peace or take it away, to supply you or deprive you, you have unknowingly stepped into victimhood, and victimhood is the great hypnotism of the human race. We are told that Jesus walked upon the water, healed the sick, fed the multitudes, and brought peace to the tormented mind. But the world has misunderstood the secret behind these acts. They were not demonstrations of a man manipulating the world. They were revelations of consciousness recognizing its own source, unafraid of appearances, uninfluenced by the shifting tides of sense testimony. The Master was not overcoming the world, he was seeing through it. He was abiding in the awareness. I and the Father are one. This teaching is not mystical poetry. It is a statement of your own nature. For the same presence that lived as Jesus lives as you now, the same light that guided him is the light of your consciousness. The difference is not in the presence, but in the recognition. And so today we begin a quiet but extraordinary journey, a journey from victim consciousness into Christ consciousness, from believing ourselves subject to conditions to recognizing ourselves as the very presence of God expressing itself as individual being. You will discover that nothing external binds you. Only the beliefs you hold in consciousness maintain the illusion of bondage. Suffering does not come because God withholds good, nor because the world is against you, nor because destiny has written an unfortunate script. Suffering comes solely from misidentification, from forgetting who you are, and from believing that what appears to confront you has power in this hour. Let us look gently and honestly at the hidden blocks that obscure the truth of your being, not to condemn ourselves, but to lift the veil that hides reality from our sight. For these blocks do not belong to you. They belong to the universal human belief in separation. And once they are seen clearly, they begin to dissolve of their own accord. The spiritual path is never about changing the outer picture. Goldsmith taught again and again, we are not in the business of improving humanhood, but of awakening from it. The moment you try to fix the world, you remain bound to it. But when you recognize the Christ within, you discover that the world has no power over you at all. Let your heart be still. Let the mind rest. For what we are about to examine is not philosophy and not metaphysics, but the living truth of your own identity. If you will walk with me in openness and receptivity, you will see that the transition from victimhood to freedom does not require struggle. It requires only recognition of that presence which is closer than breathing, nearer than hands and feet, the very life of your life. And now as we enter the deeper waters of this teaching, let us approach the first and greatest block that binds the seeker to fear and limitation. Let us settle quietly now, for we are about to touch the root of nearly all human fear, and if this one error dissolves in your awareness, you will find the entire structure of victimhood collapsing with it. There is no bondage deeper than the belief that God exists somewhere outside of you, and no freedom greater than the recognition that God is the very essence of your own consciousness. Now listen gently, not with the mind that analyzes, but with the heart that knows. Every form of begging, pleading, supplicating prayer arises from the assumption that God is out there, that God is separate, distant, withholding, or perhaps reluctant, that you must convince, persuade, or please Him in order to be cared for. This is the oldest illusion of the human race. It makes the individual feel small, powerless, dependent on outer mercy, a creature hoping for a moment of divine attention. But this is not the teaching of the Christ. This is not the realization of Jesus. This is not the truth. Joel Goldsmith dedicated his life to revealing, for Jesus never prayed to a God somewhere. He communed with a presence that lived as his very being. He said, "The Father within me, He doeth the works. Not above me, not beyond me, within me, here, in the secret chamber of consciousness, where no form exists, where no separation can be conceived. And so long as you imagine God as an external power, you will live in a state of spiritual childhood, waiting, hoping, pleading, or fearing. You will live as one without a center, without authority, without inner grounding. You will live as a victim of circumstances, because the moment God is outside you, power is outside you as well. But hear me now. God is not a power outside of His own creation. God is the life of you. The awareness with which you are listening at this moment, that is the activity of God as your consciousness. The human mind struggles with this. It says, surely God cannot be this close. Surely I must reach Him. Surely I must prove myself worthy. But this is the mind that believes in separation and therefore believes in distance. Distance is always an illusion. Separation is always an illusion. All the while, the truth stands quietly, unchanged. You are never for a single instant separated from God, for God is not an object. God is presence. God is mind. God is being. God is the invisible essence that is right where you are. As the you that you truly are, you have been taught to pray to a God who is somewhere else. But true prayer is the opposite of reaching outward. True prayer is the recognition of what is already present. Sit quietly for a moment here, now, and notice that awareness is present without your effort. Notice that you are conscious, and realize that this consciousness is not personal. It is not privately owned. It is the infinite presence of God expressing itself as your individual being. When you pray, you are not calling on a distant deity. You are turning within to the source from which all life flows. You are acknowledging, not asking. You are communing, not petitioning. You are recognizing, not requesting. This is why Goldsmith often said that the moment you recognize the presence, the prayer is complete. Nothing more is needed. There is no God outside to convince. There is only the presence within to acknowledge. And when this recognition dawns, the sense of victimhood dissolves. For how can you be a victim when the infinite is your very identity? How can you lack when the fullness of God is being you? How can you fear when life itself is the breath within you? How can you seek protection when the one presence is living in, through, and as you? It is only the belief in an external God that makes you vulnerable to the world. It is only the belief in a distant power that creates fear. It is only the belief in separation that blinds you to the truth of your being. Let us be clear. You do not need to make God come to you. You do not need to call God down from heaven. You do not need to attract God, persuade God, or earn God. You need only recognize God where God has always been, at the center of your own awareness. Say quietly, not as a ritual, but as a living recognition, I am here. The presence is here. God is the life of my consciousness. Rest in this. This is the first step out of fear. This is the first step into freedom. This is the beginning of Christ consciousness. When this truth becomes real in your experience, the world loses its power over you. You begin to see that the outer struggle was never between you and circumstances, but between truth and illusion within consciousness. And now that we have uncovered this first and greatest block, let us move gently to the next veil that must be lifted from your awareness. My friends, now that we have seen the first veil, the belief in a God outside of ourselves, we must turn to a second obstacle that is just as deep, just as subtle, and often far more painful in its effects. It is the belief that the problems appearing in our experience are ours, that they belong to us, cling to us, define us, and describe something true about our identity. This belief, more than anything, binds the seeker to a life of fear. For the moment you say, my sickness, my fear, my lack, my trauma, my problem, you have unknowingly stepped into a false identity, an identity of separation, vulnerability, and limitation. You have attached the infinite being of God to a temporary picture in human thought, and in that moment, the illusion gains power over you. But listen very quietly. No problem is personal. No difficulty belongs to you as the spiritual being you are. Every form of discord, whether it appears as illness, fear, conflict, or lack, arises from the universal belief in separation, never from the truth of your identity. The problem is not your problem. It is the impersonal suggestion that life exists apart from God, that there is something other than the one presence expressing itself. Joel Goldsmith taught this plainly. You are not fighting your own errors. You are being confronted with the world's belief in two powers. When you understand this, something extraordinary happens. You stop wrestling. You stop blaming yourself. You stop defending your identity against the shadows of human belief. You stand still, and the truth begins to shine through. Let us look at this clearly. When pain arises, the human mind says, "This is my suffering. Something is wrong with me." But Christ consciousness says, "This is the world's belief in separation appearing as sensation. It is not the truth of my being." When lack appears, the human mind says, "I have failed. I am unworthy. I am powerless." But Christ consciousness says, this is universal fear taking form in appearance. It is not a statement about God's infinite nature expressing as my life. When conflict arises, the human mind says, "I am being attacked. I must defend." But Christ consciousness says, "No one is separate from me. What I witness is the world's belief in division. It is not the reality of the one presence." When fear arises, The human mind says, I must escape this. I must fix this. But Christ's consciousness says, fear is not mine. Fear is the hypnotism of the collective mind, fading in the light of recognition. This shift from personalization to impersonalization is one of the greatest turning points in the spiritual life. For the moment you stop claiming the world's beliefs as your own, you stop giving them power. And when you stop giving them power, they begin to dissolve. This is why Jesus never treated disease, never battled evil, never struggled with conditions. He saw through them. He recognized their impersonal nature. He perceived only the Father, the one presence. Where others saw separation, so must we. Let me illustrate with a simple example inspired by countless experiences shared in Goldsmith's work. A woman once came for help, burdened with deep anxiety that seemed uncontrollable. She had labored under this condition for years, believing it was her flaw, her weakness, her failure. And because she believed it was hers, she fought it daily and lost. But when she was gently shown that the fear was not personal, that it did not originate in her spiritual identity, that it was nothing but the universal belief in separation appearing to her awareness, she stopped fighting. She stopped resisting. And in that moment of silent release, the fear began to crumble. It had no root in her. She had simply assumed ownership of what never belonged to her. This same truth applies to every appearance we face. The moment you say, this is not mine, this is not about me, the burden lifts. You return to your rightful standpoint as the witness, not the sufferer. Do not misunderstand. This is not denial. This is not refusal to look at the condition. It is the refusal to identify with it. You see the appearance, but you do not marry it. You experience the sensation, but you do not call it your own. You observe the fear, but you do not say, I am afraid. You say, fear is appearing, but I am the presence that beholds it. And slowly, gently, this awareness dissolves the sense of a separate self burdened by personal problems. Christ consciousness is not the improvement of the human condition. It is the recognition that the human condition was never your identity. You stand as the light, not the shadow. You stand as the presence, not the appearance. You stand as the infinite I am, not the limited I am this, I am that of personal belief. And as you stand in this recognition, you will find a new peace flowing into your experience, a peace that the world cannot give and cannot take away. We have now lifted the second veil, and already, if you listen deeply, you may feel the subtle freedom that comes from detaching your identity from the world's suggestions. But there is still another powerful hypnotism to face, one that every seeker must learn to see through. Now, let us come to one of the most persistent obstacles on the spiritual path, a powerful pull of the senses. For even when we understand that God is not outside of us, and even when we begin to recognize that problems are not personal, the testimony of the five senses still stands before us like a great wall of authority. We look at the world through eyes that see only form. We listen through ears that hear only sound. We feel sensations in the body, weigh numbers on a scale, watch bank accounts shift, observe relationships changing, and instantly we draw conclusions based on what the senses report. But hear me quietly now. Sense testimony is not spiritual truth. It is only the picture faith of the material world appearing to you as though it were real. This is the great hypnotism of human experience. The senses report appearances, and the mind accepts them as reality. But reality, true reality, is not seen with the eyes, nor heard with the ears, nor felt with the body. Reality is revealed in consciousness, in that silent inner awareness where God speaks as presence. Every discord in your experience begins with this one acceptance. I believe what my senses tell me. And the moment you grant absolute authority to the senses, you hand over your peace. You stake your identity on what is visible and measurable. You surrender your stability to circumstances that rise and fall like waves on the sea. If the body feels weak, the senses say there is danger. If money is low, the senses say there is lack. And if conflict arises, the senses say there is separation. If fear stirs within, the senses say you are threatened. And so long as you believe these reports, you remain bound to the conditions they present. But Christ consciousness, the awareness Jesus lived from, was not governed by appearances. When he looked upon disease, he did not see a sick person. When he faced lack, he did not see scarcity. When he encountered storm, he did not see danger. He saw only God. He saw only the presence behind the appearance. He saw only the invisible reality that outshines the visible condition. And so must we learn to see. Joel Goldsmith taught that discord arises only when we take appearance to be reality. The moment you believe what the senses show you, you step into the dream of the material world. The dream has its pleasures and its pains, its rises and its falls, but it has no stability, no permanence, no truth. Now let me speak plainly. This does not mean you must deny what appears before you. It does not mean closing your eyes to the body or the bank account or the relationship. It does not mean pretending the condition is not visible. It means recognizing that while the appearance may be present, it has no spiritual authority. You may see weakness in the body, but you know the truth of your being is infinite life. You may see limitation in the finances, but you know the truth of your being is infinite supply. You may see conflict among people, but you know the truth of all being is the one presence, expressing itself in infinite form. You may feel fear in the mind, but you know the truth of your being is peace that is not touched by emotion. When you refuse to grant authority to the senses, you shift the seat of power from the outer world to the inner presence. And in that shift, the appearance begins to lose its grip. Let me give an illustration, simple but true. A man once came deeply troubled by a financial crisis. His business was failing, debts were rising, customers had disappeared, every visible sign declared lack. And as long as he believed the numbers, he lived in fear. But when he began to sit daily in the recognition, not of supply out there, but of the infinite, that was his very consciousness, something changed. He stopped looking at the bank account as cause. He stopped treating the outer picture as reality. He looked through the appearance and rested in the truth. I and the source of all supply are one. He made no human attempt to force conditions to change. He simply stopped believing the senses and returned again and again to the inner presence. And then, without struggle, without strain, without manipulation, the appearance reorganized itself to match the consciousness that held it. The supply that seemed absent appeared. Opportunities came. Harmony returned. So it is with all conditions. We do not change the outer by manipulating the outer. We change the outer by refusing to accept the outer as power. The world, as it appears, is not the kingdom of God. The kingdom is within, and when you dwell there, The world's testimony loses its ability to frighten you. Look upon the appearance, but do not bow to it. Acknowledge what the senses show, but do not call it truth. Recognize the condition, but recognize more clearly the presence behind it. For spiritual vision sees not with the eyes, but with the heart that knows, I am the light in which this appearance dissolves. When you take back the authority you unknowingly gave to the senses, the great hypnotism weakens, and in that weakening, peace returns, clarity returns, guidance returns, and the presence reveals itself more freely in your experience. Now that we have exposed the third block, let us move gently to an even subtler one, the seeker's hunger for dramatic experiences, visions, or signs, which unknowingly keeps him from the quiet certainty of realization. Now we come to a very subtle block, one that appears spiritual, feels spiritual, and is often celebrated by the world as progress, yet it quietly prevents the seeker from realizing the presence already within. It is the desire for spiritual experiences, visions, signs, sensations, mystical fireworks, sudden breakthroughs, emotional ecstasy, dramatic demonstrations, and proofs that something is happening to the human mind. This hunger feels noble. It says, if I could only see a sign, then I would know. If I could feel a surge of energy, then I would believe. If I could witness a miracle, then my faith would be complete. But listen carefully. The desire for experience is the ego's last disguise. It is the subtle clinging to personal will, personal achievement, personal attainment, for what is behind the longing for signs. It is the assumption that the presence is not already here. It is the belief that God must prove himself. It is the hidden conviction that I have not yet arrived, or I need something spectacular to validate the truth. This is the same hypnotism that causes the world to chase pleasure, sensation, emotion, and stimulation. But in spiritual form, it becomes even more seductive. The seeker believes he is progressing, when in truth he is simply moving further outward, further into the realm of appearances, away from the quiet center where God is realized. Joel Goldsmith often cautioned his students, the presence comes as a still small voice, not through thunder or spectacle. The more subtle the revelation, the more genuine it is, the more quiet the unfolding, the more deeply rooted it becomes. The more inward the recognition, the more permanent its effect. The human mind craves drama. Spirit speaks in silence. The human mind wants proof. Spirit reveals itself as the very awareness, observing the desire. The human mind demands sensation. Spirit whispers, be still and know that I am. Let me speak plainly. Every time you seek an outer confirmation, a sign, a feeling, a dramatic moment, you turn away from the unchanging presence already within. You exchange the infinite for the temporary. You replace the real with a fleeting appearance. And even when a dramatic experience occurs, it does not satisfy. For the seeker begins chasing the next one, and then the next one. Spiritual life becomes a cycle of pursuit, not a state of peace. Consider this. Jesus said nothing about seeking visions. He did not instruct his disciples to chase mystical sensations. He never told anyone to wait for fireworks. He said simply, the kingdom of God is within you, not outside. Not in the sky, not in visions, not in supernatural displays, within, in the silence of being. Joel Goldsmith lived this truth deeply. He repeatedly warned, if you are seeking experience, you are missing God. True realization is not accompanied by emotional eruption. It is often a gentle dawning, like the faintest light appearing at the edge of the horizon. It comes without effort, without strain, without anticipation. It comes because you have stopped looking outward and begun resting inward. Let me give a simple example that captures this principle. A sincere student once confessed that she spent hours waiting for a surge of energy in meditation, imagining that such a feeling would indicate God's presence. When none came, she felt discouraged, believing she had failed. But after being instructed to release all expectation and sit in pure stillness, not as a technique but as recognition, something shifted, not dramatically, not sensationally, but quietly. A deep peace arose, subtle yet steady, without any accompanying vision or force. And in that peace came the unmistakable awareness of God, not as feeling, not as event, but as presence. The human mind did not celebrate it, for it was not dramatic, but her soul knew, this is the truth, this is the presence. From that moment, her spiritual life stopped being a pursuit of experiences and became a continual resting in being. And with that shift came wisdom, clarity, healing, and guidance, all without drama. Now let us make this perfectly clear. You do not need a sign to know God is present. You do not need a miracle to know life is whole. You do not need a sensation to know the Christ lives as your own consciousness. If you sit in silence with no experience whatsoever and simply rest in the truth that the I Am is here, you have already fulfilled the highest form of prayer. When you release the hunger for experiences, the presence becomes visible to the inner eye. When you stop chasing miracles, the miraculous becomes natural. When you stop seeking proof, peace reveals itself without effort. And now, having dissolved the fourth block, we are ready to speak of what happens when these obstacles begin to fall away. The gentle and profound shift from humanhood to spiritual identity. My friends, now we come to one of the greatest transitions in the entire spiritual journey, the movement from the consciousness of victimhood to the consciousness of the Christ. This is not a step you force. It is not a change you accomplish through determination or discipline. It is a gentle dawning, a gradual unveiling that occurs as the obstacles we have addressed, externalizing God, personalizing problems, trusting appearances, seeking experiences, begin to dissolve from the mind. It is not that you acquire something new. It is that you drop what was never true. It is not that you become spiritual. It is that you stop believing you were ever anything else. Victimhood is the natural state of the human mind. The human mind sees itself as small, vulnerable, reactive, and dependent on conditions. It interprets every disturbance as a threat, every challenge as a burden, every change as loss. Human consciousness says, life happens to me. People control my peace. The world determines my safety. My body determines my well-being. My past defines my present. The reason, but listen quietly, this is the dream. This is the hypnotism. This is the false self. The Christ, the true identity, knows nothing of victimhood. The Christ is not a religious figure, not a historical personality, not a supernatural entity. The Christ is the presence of God expressed as your very consciousness, your true nature, your real identity, your eternal being. Where the human self sees danger, the Christ sees God's presence. Where the human self sees lack, the Christ sees infinite supply. Where the human self sees conflict, the Christ sees one life expressing in many forms. Where the human self sees limitation, the Christ sees the boundlessness of spirit. The human cries, Why is this happening to me? The Christ knows nothing is happening to me. All unfolds through the one presence. The human says, I must defend myself. The Christ says, there is no self apart from God to defend. The human says, I am afraid. The Christ says, fear is a passing appearance in consciousness, not my identity. This shift from victimhood to Christ, awareness is not dramatic. There is no trumpet, no announcement, no burst of emotion. It begins quietly, inwardly, as a subtle recognition that you are not the one you thought yourself to be. It begins the moment you stop saying, I am this condition, and instead whisper inwardly, I am. Just that. I am, without describing, without qualifying, without attaching a condition, pure being, untouched by circumstance. This is the birthplace of spiritual identity. You may still walk through the same world. You may still face the same outer conditions, but your relationship to them changes completely. Where once you reacted automatically to appearances, you now pause. Where once you feared loss, you now sense a deeper security. Where once you fought for control, you now let the presence lead. Where once you sought results, you now rest in realization. This is not weakness. It is not passivity. It is the strength that comes from knowing that God is your life, your mind, your supply, your safety, your being. And when you know this, not intellectually, but inwardly, you are no longer a victim of anything in the visible world. In this awareness, a great peace begins to move through you, not because circumstances have changed, but because your relationship to circumstances has changed. You stop believing that external conditions have the power to grant or remove your good. You stop looking to people for love, recognition, or approval. You stop depending on the body for validation of health. You stop relying on possessions for security, not because you reject these things, but because you no longer see them as causes, and as the sense of victimhood dissolves, something beautiful emerges. You begin to live from the inside out. You begin to move through life as an instrument through which the presence expresses itself. You begin to respond instead of react. You begin to see others not as opponents or obstacles, but as expressions of the same one life. Even conflict appears differently. The person who once offended you is now seen through the lens of impersonal truth. Someone like you, caught temporarily in the dream of separation, forgiveness becomes natural, not as a moral effort, but as a recognition of what is real. And perhaps most extraordinary of all, you find that your choices, your actions, your relationships, your work, your entire life begin to unfold with a harmony that does not come from planning or willpower, but from alignment with the infinite intelligence that is your very being. Victimhood collapses not because you fix your problems, but because you stop identifying with the one who has them. You awaken into the truth. I live, yet not I, the Christ, liveth as me. This is not arrogance. This is humility. It is the release of the personal self into the presence. It is the quiet knowing, I of mine own self do nothing. The Father within me doeth the works. And as this realization deepens, life becomes a flow rather than a struggle, a revelation rather than a reaction, an unfolding rather than a battle. This is the beginning, only the beginning of Christ awareness. Now that we have seen what this inner shift looks like, we can proceed to something essential for anchoring it, the practice of impersonalization in daily life. As we move deeper into this spiritual work, We must now examine one of the most liberating practices Joel Goldsmith ever taught, the impersonalization of error. This single principle, understood and applied, can remove years of unnecessary suffering from your experience, dissolve fear in an instant, and lift the entire burden of self-condemnation from your shoulders. For every form of discord, whether it appears as illness, conflict, fear, or lack, becomes intensified the very moment you say, "This is mine," or "This is happening because of me," or "This reveals something about my spiritual failure." But hear this truth clearly. Error is never personal, never. It is always impersonal, always the universal belief in separation, presenting itself to individual consciousness as though it were your own. When you see this, truly see it, the burden lifts immediately. You stop fighting shadows. You stop blaming yourself. You stop believing that conditions reflect your identity. Let us explore this gently. When a physical symptom arises, the human mind instantly claims it, my illness, my problem, my condition. But the moment you claim it as yours, you give it a life it does not possess. You attach your divine identity to an appearance, and the appearance becomes solidified in experience. But when you recognize it as a universal belief in separation, not a personal truth, the weight evaporates. You no longer stand as the sufferer, you stand as the witness. When financial difficulty appears, the mind says, I failed, I lack, I am limited. But lack is not personal. It is not yours. It is not caused by you, nor does it describe you. It is the impersonal belief that supply exists outside of consciousness, a universal hypnotism of the world mind. And when you see it as such, the fear of it dissolves, for you recognize your true supply is not out there, but within the very presence of God expressing as your consciousness. When conflict arises in a relationship, the mind says, they are against me, they hurt me, this is my emotional wound. But conflict, too, is impersonal. It is the world belief in separation, acting itself out temporarily through personalities. Once you see this, you no longer react from hurt. You no longer need to defend, attack, or withdraw. You recognize the spiritual truth that behind every person stands the same, one presence, unhurt, unoffended, unopposed. This practice, impersonalization, is not denial. It is not ignoring facts. It is not pretending that a problem is not appearing. It is seeing the appearance without giving it personal identity. Joel Goldsmith often said, if you can keep error impersonal, you disarm it. If you make it personal, you empower it. The authority of the error is granted by your identification with it. The dissolution of the error occurs the moment you withdraw that identification. Let me illustrate this with an inward example. Imagine a wave rising on the surface of the ocean. If the wave believed it had a separate life, separate destiny, separate identity, then every rising and falling would feel like terror. But when the wave recognizes itself as the ocean, not as an isolated form, it loses its fear. So it is with you. When you believe the rising and falling of conditions are your life, you live in fear, tension, and constant self-judgment. But when you recognize that your life is the ocean of God's presence, eternal, unchanging, infinite, then appearances on the surface no longer have the power to frighten you. You are not the wave. You are the ocean appearing as the wave. This is the core of impersonalization. Error is not a statement about your identity. It is a universal suggestion appearing momentarily in the field of awareness, and when you refuse to identify with it, it loses all authority. But how do we practice this? We practice it gently, consistently, moment to moment. A fearful thought arises. Do not claim it. Do not analyze it. Do not resist it. Simply recognize this is the universal belief in separation, presenting itself as fear. It is not I. A feeling of sadness arises. Recognize. This is not my nature. It is a passing appearance. I remain the presence, witnessing it. An impulse to worry arises. Recognize. This is the world belief in two powers. I need not entertain it. A physical symptom appears. Recognize. This is the belief in life apart from God. It is not my spiritual identity. And in that recognition, the condition begins to dissolve, not because you fought it, but because you removed the only thing that empowered it, your identification. You stand now not as a human trying to improve conditions, but as the Christ, the divine presence, witnessing and dissolving illusion. This is the beginning of spiritual mastery. When error is impersonalized, its sting is removed. When its sting is removed, its power collapses. When its power collapses, only the presence remains. And when only the presence remains, harmony naturally unfolds. Now that we have learned to strip error of its false identity, we must take another step. We must learn to listen, to truly listen to the still small voice within. For impersonalization prepares the mind, but listening opens the soul. My friends, having traveled through the work of impersonalization, we are now ready to enter one of the most sacred aspects of spiritual life, the art of listening. Not listening with the ears, nor listening for words, nor listening for messages from outside ourselves, but listening inwardly for the movement of the Spirit, the still small voice that speaks not in sound but in silence. Every step of the spiritual path has been preparing you for this moment. For until the mind ceases to cling to appearances, until it releases personal struggle, until it stops chasing dramatic experiences, until it recognizes the impersonal nature of error, it is not yet quiet enough to hear the voice of God. The Spirit does not shout. It does not argue. It does not debate. It does not force its way into a noisy mind. It whispers. It moves gently. It appears as a subtle knowing, a soft illumination, a resting, a peace that has no cause and no explanation. Joel Goldsmith often said, "It is in quietness that the presence is made known," and so we learn to enter quietness, not as a technique, not as a method to attain something, but as a sacred resting in the truth that God is already here. When we sit in silence, we are not waiting for an answer. We are not waiting for guidance. We are not waiting for God to speak. We are simply creating a space in consciousness where the already present voice can be heard. Human thought is restless. It seeks solutions. It analyzes questions, argues, and predicts. It wants to control outcomes. It wants to map the future. It wants to understand the past. The still small voice does none of these things. Divine guidance does not explain. It reveals. It does not instruct in words. It unfolds in consciousness. It does not tell you what will happen. It tells you what is now, beneath appearances. It never speaks in fear, never in urgency, never in tension, never in pressure. When you feel pushed, pressured, or overwhelmed, you are hearing the voice of the human mind, not the spirit. The spirit reveals itself as peace, always peace, even in the midst of challenge. And in that peace, decisions become clear without effort. Actions unfold without strain. The next step presents itself as naturally as a flower opening in the morning sun. This is how Joel Goldsmith lived his entire ministry. He never planned a lecture. He never prepared a message. He never relied on human thought. He entered the silence, opened his consciousness, and allowed the presence to speak. The human mind might say, "But what if nothing comes?" And the Christ within whispers, "The presence is always here. You need only be quiet enough to feel it." Guidance may come as a sense of rightness, without explanation, an inner nudge, subtle and gentle, a release of tension around one option and not the other, the sudden disappearance of fear, a deeper peace rising when contemplating the next step, an intuitive knowing that requires no reasoning, an unfolding harmony that reveals itself over hours, days, or weeks. Never expect dramatic revelation. Never seek thunder. Never wait for lightning. The presence reveals itself as a stillness, a settling, a soft clarity that the world cannot give. Let me offer a simple illustration of how spiritual guidance operates. A man once faced a difficult decision about his work. The choices before him seemed equally reasonable. He prayed, he analyzed, he weighed pros and cons, and the more he thought, the more confused he became. Finally, he remembered Joel's instruction. Do not think your way into harmony. Rest your way into it. So he set aside the problem, entered silence, and for several minutes simply rested in the awareness that God is the life, the mind, and the guidance of his being. No answer came, no voice spoke, no sign appeared, but later that evening, without effort, a quiet certainty arose in him. This is the way. He followed it, and in the weeks that followed, every door opened effortlessly. Harmony revealed itself as the seal of divine guidance. You see, guidance is not the Spirit telling you what to do. Guidance is the Spirit revealing what already is the right unfoldment. The human mind chooses. The Spirit knows. The human mind plans. The Spirit reveals. The human mind fears. The Spirit is peace. The transition from human thought to spiritual guidance is the transition from fear to peace, from effort to allowing, from seeking to resting. This is not a practice you master overnight. It deepens over months, years, decades, but even one moment of listening, truly listening, can shift the entire direction of your life. And now, my friends, as we enter the final section, we will bring these teachings into full circle, understanding how all of this leads not to a transformed humanhood, but to the realization of God as the one and only life, presence, and identity, expressing as you, my friends. You have journeyed through the great obstacles of the spiritual path: mistaken identity, personalizing error, trusting sense testimony, chasing experiences, and living from the belief that life happens to you. We have lifted the veils one by one, not by effort, but by the light of truth. Now, in this final movement, let us come gently to the heart of it all. The realization of I am. Not the words, not the phrase, not the concept or the theology, but the living recognition that the presence which says I within you is not human, not personal, not limited, and not separate from God. It is God expressing as individual consciousness. It is the Christ identity present, alive, here. This teaching does not ask you to become spiritual. It asks you to stop believing you are anything other than spirit already. It does not ask you to achieve union with God. It reveals that separation was never real. It does not ask you to fix your human life. It shows you that the human life was never your identity. When Jesus said, I am the way, he did not speak as a man pointing to himself. He spoke from the I am presence, that is the life of every being. He spoke from the Christ, that is the root of all consciousness. He spoke from the truth that you and I share this same identity. And now you begin to glimpse what Joel Goldsmith spent his entire life demonstrating. The I am is not a path. The I am is not a destination. The I am is not a state you enter. The I am is the reality that has been living as you from the beginning. What changes is not God. What changes is your recognition. You recognize that you are not a victim of conditions. You recognize that no error belongs to you. You recognize that appearances cannot define truth. You recognize that God is not approached through desire, but known through silence. You recognize that guidance rises from within, not from without, and slowly, gently, the sense of a separate self begins to fall away. You do not lose anything real. You lose only the false ideas that never belonged to you. When the false dissolves, the true emerges not dramatically, not suddenly, but naturally. Like dawn spreading over the horizon, you wake in the morning with a stillness that was not there before. You meet challenges with an equanimity you cannot explain. You interact with others from a place of inner fullness, not need. You find guidance arising without effort. You discover supply flowing without fear. You experience health revealing itself without struggle. Not because you made any of these things happen, but because the presence that is your life began to express itself without obstruction. This is the real meaning of spiritual demonstration. Not changing outer conditions, but revealing the inner truth, not manipulating appearances, but recognizing the one presence. And now something even deeper becomes clear. The goal of this path is not to improve the personal self, but to outgrow the belief in a personal self entirely. The more deeply you rest in the I am, the less you seek results, the less you chase answers, the more guidance unfolds. The less you cling to control, the more effortless harmony appears. The less you insist on what you want, the more the infinite reveals what already is. This is the region of grace. This is the life lived by the Spirit. This is the natural state of the I am realized. And so, my friends, we close this journey not with a conclusion, but with a gentle invitation, live from the I am. Let the truth be your identity. Let the presence be your activity. Let the silence be your teacher. You do not need to hold these teachings tightly. You do not need to master anything. You do not need to strive. Truth does not need your effort. It needs only your recognition. Sit quietly each day, even for a few minutes, and return to the truth. I am. Nothing more, nothing added, nothing qualified. And let the presence reveal itself. For the I am that spoke through Jesus, the I am that illumined the prophets, the I am that lived through Joel Goldsmith, is the very same I am speaking in you now. This is the way. This is the life. This is the truth. This is the light that cannot be hidden and cannot be extinguished, and it is your very being.